Good. All right, let's talk about the synoptic problem. The synoptic gospels are what?
Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Very good. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Synoptic means to see with, because they all kind of present similar tales of Jesus. 8 general rules for the synoptics. 1, the 3 have much material in common. This is the triple tradition. Right? So something that appears in Matthew, Mark, and Luke is called triple tradition, because it shows up in all 3. The arrangement of the common material generally follows Mark's order. Where Matthew or Luke differs from Mark's order, the other tends to agree with Mark. Hence, there is alternating support for Mark's order. Right? In other words, if Mark's timeline is here and Matthew has a story here, Luke is likely to either have it here, or if Luke has moved it, then Matthew probably has it where Mark has it. If Matthew has moved it, Luke probably has it where Mark has it. Okay? Matthew includes roughly 90% of Mark, so almost all of Mark shows up in Matthew. Luke includes roughly 50%. Since Mark is shorter than either Matthew or Luke, it necessarily includes a much smaller percentage of each of those Gospels. Okay? There are relatively few significant agreements between Matthew and Luke over against Mark. Okay? Agreements of Matthew and Mark against Luke and agreements of Luke and Mark against Matthew are much more common. All right? Agreement between Matthew and Luke tends to begin where Mark's gospel begins. Right? So Matthew and Luke both have infancy narratives. They are very different. Right? One focuses on Joseph, the other focuses on Mary. One has shepherds, or has wise men come a couple years later. The other has shepherds, the night of the birth. One has them living in Bethlehem. The other has them traveling from Nazareth. Completely different stories at the beginning of Matthew and Luke. But once we start hitting the baptism, then we start getting a lot more similarity. Similarly, with the end of the gospel, they each have stories that go beyond the empty tomb, which is where Mark ends. Right? That's worth noting too. That the end of Mark is kind of like the end of The Sopranos. It's a sudden fade to black, and everybody's going, "What?" and throwing things at the TV screen, and right. And several people said, "Well, this can't be the way it ends," and so they go ahead and add the ending, and a couple of those got put in, and that's the end of chapter 16 now. But the way the Gospel of Mark seems to have originally ended is with the women going away afraid, and finally they get permission. Okay, now you can go tell everybody. And what do? I'm not going to tell anybody this. Right? So Matthew and Luke both go beyond that, but again, they're very different. In fact, they take place in different accounts. Where does Jesus meet the disciples in Matthew? Well, in Galilee, right? Which is where the angel tells them in Mark, he will meet you on the mountain in Galilee that he told you to go to. Where does he meet them in Luke? And tell them not to leave. Yeah, in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem. So Luke has the resurrection appearances in Jerusalem. Matthew has them in Galilee. John has both. And Mark doesn't have any. So once you lose the common thread of Mark, they again get very divergent. All right? Does that make sense?
They become independent.
Yeah. They lose their sense of commonality. The same is true in individual pericopes. All right? You'll find the most difference at the beginning of the pericopes and at the end. And then in the middle, they'll tend to be a lot more similarity. So they'll usually provide their own setting, and sometimes they'll draw their own conclusion or lesson, but then the middle tends to be more similar. Okay?
I'm sorry, what's it?
Passage. Yeah, it's just a fancy word for passage. Okay? Points 2 through 6, and this will show up on the slide even though it's cut off on the screen, establish Mark as the middle term. Okay? If you look at, if you have your synopsis, Look at section 38.
38.
Not page 38, but section 38. Yes. Okay, now just a couple things to note. You'll notice that some of these gospel headings where it tells you what you're looking at are bold-faced. For 38, which ones are bold-faced? Mark and Luke. And what that tells you is this is where it occurs in Mark and Luke. We are tracking with Mark and Luke's order at this point. Matthew has a parallel passage, but it's in a different location. And so Matthew is not in boldface. Okay, if you want to know where it appears in Matthew's, you see right under there where it says compare number 88. The CP means compare. Where it says compare, right under the title, compare number 88. If you look at section 88, it will be the same passage, but Matthew will be boldface and Mark and Luke will be non-bold. Okay, because 88 is where it occurs in Matthew's order. All right, does that make sense? And it tells you right under Matthew too, number 88, page 76. So if you want to see it in Matthew's placement, flip over to page 76 and you'll see the exact same passage, but where it falls in Matthew.
And when they're in the synopsis, sometimes it has two columns
for Matthew, yes. So like on your homework, the Beelzebub passage. What that means is that Matthew actually has two parallel passages to that. Within his gospel. So he's kind of, he took that passage and doubled it. And so that's why they include both. Okay? So note what Mark says. That evening at sundown. Right? Now how does Matthew start? How does Luke start? Right? So what you see here, Mark has this kind of redundancy. That evening at sundown. Matthew has one of those that evening. Luke has a play on the other one. Now the question then becomes, is it more likely that Mark had the redundancy and Matthew happened to choose one and Luke chose the other? Or Mark is using Matthew and Luke and decides, you know what, I need to put both of these in there. I need to say at evening and then further specify, or that evening and then further specify at sundown.
That doesn't sound likely.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree. But those are the kinds of questions you have. What's more likely? Is it more likely that, but Mark seems to be the middle term, right? It's the one that connects the other two. That's what that means. And the easiest way to explain that is either Mark being first or Mark being last. Right? Either Mark is last and drawing from both of them, or Mark is first and the other two just happen to take different parts. Okay, does that make sense? Yeah. Puzzle over.
When you look at the different sections in the homework, that has that part.
Yeah.
I get. So, could it ever have been the Griesbach?
The Griesbach model?
Yeah. So, I thought that seemed more plausible for everything because it seems that Luke usually more Matthew, and I thought Mark may have been last.
Okay, good. So for the passage you looked at for homework, that's a little bit, we said that usually, and 8 rules, but rule meant very kind of in a squishy way. These are not hard and fast. And so as we said, Mark is usually the middle term, and so if you get alternating support from Mark. In the passage you looked at for homework, you actually get alternating support for Matthew.
Yeah.
Which suggests Matthew is the middle term for that passage, which means Matthew is likely either first, which is what Griesbach proposes, or last, which no one has really championed. So you're absolutely right. If all we had was the passage you looked at for homework, Griesbach would make a lot of sense because it suggests that Matthew comes first. Okay. Now there are other reasons why I think Griesbach doesn't work as well in the larger picture.
Yeah. Now it was with this example.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's why you've got to kind of take the whole into account. But you're absolutely right. For the passage you looked at, Griesbach can make sense of that really well.
Yeah, that's how I based the answer on that. And now when we're going through this, it might be more of a
trouble with the passage that you looked at. And we'll talk about why, but the reason is because it suggests Luke actually knows Matthew. And that's a problem for the two source. We'll go through all those in a minute. But you're absolutely right. And part of the reason why it's hard to tease all this out is because you have passages that suggest different things. And so it's hard to tease out because Mark's not always seeming to be the middle term. There are passages where Matthew seems to be the middle term. And so the truth is, how all of this got worked out is probably a lot more complicated than you can represent in a simple little model like Mark was first, Matthew used Mark, and Luke used both. Or there was Mark and Q, and Matthew was using Mark and Q, and Luke was using Mark and Q. But the more complicated it gets, the less likely we're going to have any chance of actually reconstructing what happened. Right? And so I think in your reading, you saw a couple of those more complicated where you've got an Mark and a proto-Luke, and then they're changing and interacting based on interaction with one another. And that's probably more like what happened, but it's impossible to really reconstruct a process that is that complicated. Does that make sense? Yes. Yes.
It really is not
of that particular passage. I'm thinking, oh, Matthew was connecting Luke and Mark. But when we read this, I'm like, oh, Mark was connecting everything else. So.
Yeah. So we'll look at reasons why people think Mark came first, because that's most scholars think Mark came first. But you're absolutely right. On the passage you had, it would make a lot more sense if Matthew was pulling things together, or Matthew seems to be, the way Griesbachians argue that is Matthew seems to be a coherent, cohesive account, and so it's more likely that Matthew was first and the other two were picking it apart than that he took their pieces and composed such a nice unified account.
Especially with like missing description. Certain things.
Yeah.
In that Matthew seems to be more fluid in the flow of how
Yes.
it goes in comparison to Luke and Mark.
Yes. Yes. And actually, if you continue on to the passage after the one you looked at, that alternating support for Matthew continues. Excellent point. All right. Two other rules. 7. Matthew and Luke have about 200 verses in common that do not appear in Mark, and that exhibit varying degrees of verbatim agreement, from almost 100%. If we look up Elan 285, you'd see it's almost verbatim, Matthew and Luke, to almost none. This is called the double tradition, which some scholars identify as Q, which is short for German Quelle, which means source. Okay? This double tradition material does not appear in the same order in Matthew and Luke relative to the shared Markan framework. For the most part, again, hold these as rules loosely. But what that means is that for the Q material, the stuff that Matthew and Luke have in common, if Matthew puts it here relative to Mark, Luke is likely to have it somewhere else. And this is one of the reasons for thinking that Matthew and Luke don't know one another. Because the thing is, if Luke knows Matthew, surely at some point he would think Matthew's placement made sense. Right? Oh no, it's another passage that's not in Mark, I got to move it somewhere else. Right? But if they're both independently working from a second source and trying to work that into Mark, then you can understand how they work it in different places. Okay? So, Pressing on. The Griesbach hypothesis, which we were just talking about. In this hypothesis, which gospel comes first? Matthew. Who uses Matthew?
Luke and Mark.
And Mark uses both. Right. Okay? So, this makes good sense of Mark as the middle term, in some ways, because you can explain how he's kind of drawing from both. However, the problem is the evidence for Markan priority. Okay, well, what is the evidence for Markan priority? Well, some scholars, and some of these arguments are stronger than others. The argument from order. Matthew and Luke support Mark's order. But this doesn't actually argue for Markan priority, it just argues that Mark is the middle term. And again, usually. What you have to show is that Matthew and Luke work better as a redaction of Mark than Mark as a redaction of Matthew and Luke. In other words, it makes more sense that Matthew and Luke are modifying Mark and his order than that Mark has Matthew and Luke and came up with this particular order. Okay. Second is dates. Well, how do we know when these are written? Well, we don't. And so the way scholars do this is they try to look for contemporary events that the gospel writers seem aware of. So, several think that Matthew and Luke are aware of the destruction of Jerusalem. Why? Well, in Matthew's parable about the wedding banquet, the king is so upset that he sends out his armies to destroy those who would not come. Most scholars think that's a reference to the destruction of Jerusalem and the revolt, and obviously you can't predict things like that are going to happen, and so that has to have been written after the fact. Similarly, in Luke, Jesus warns the people, when you see armies surround Jerusalem, know that the time is at hand and it's time to get out. And so that's taken as a reference to Rome besieging Jerusalem, and again, therefore, after the fact. On the other hand, in Mark 13, which is where they come out and the disciples are like, wow, isn't all these stones amazing, this temple amazing? And Jesus says what? Truly I tell you, the day is coming when not one stone will be left upon another. And it's argued that actually didn't happen, because we still have the Wailing Wall that you can go and touch today, where you have at least one stone on another. And so it suggested Mark was close enough to the time that he could see the handwriting on the wall, but didn't actually see the destruction because he mischaracterizes it. Well, depending on how you think of prophecy and all of this, those are more compelling or less. Another reason for thinking Mark is early, though, is again, as we looked at a couple weeks ago, he mentions at the end Rufus and Alexander. Now, who are Rufus and Alexander the sons of? Simon of Cyrene, who carried the cross of Jesus. Now, why do you mention Rufus and Alexander? Well, we don't know a famous Rufus and Alexander that everybody knows from the early church. So it's probably the fact that he was known to Mark and Mark's early readers. Right? Just like in the church, in your local congregation, if something's happening out in the real world that has a connection, you'd say, this is, Mamie's, grandson, or, you make the connection. And that seems to be what Mark is doing, which means that he's writing, within a generation of these events. Okay? All right? The third thing that people argue for Markan priority are Markan omissions, the things that Mark leaves out. Why would Mark omit so much of the double tradition, such as the Lord's Prayer, when the omitted portions would have been conducive to his theological and literary interests? Now, this last part is what you have to really wrestle with. You'll get a lot of scholars that say these evangelists were not authors, they weren't composing carefully, they were just throwing together all the stories they knew about Jesus. So if they didn't include it, that means they didn't know it. Well, as you've hopefully just seen, Mark is very carefully crafted. He has a very specific portrait to paint, story to tell. So it's not enough to just say, oh, well, he left it out. You'd have to show why it would have been particularly useful in his tightly crafted thing to have included it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So, then you also have to look at the Markan additions. There are 3 passages or pericopes that appear in Mark alone, and only 3. The healing of the deaf man with spittle, the healing of the blind man where it takes 2 touches that we looked at last time, and then the naked man when Jesus gets arrested and the guy has his linen covering grabbed and he wriggles out of it and runs away naked. Is it more likely that Mark, having all of Matthew and Luke, would have decided, you know what, I need to add these 3 episodes in and only these 3 episodes? Or that Matthew and Luke decided, you know what, I don't really need that story in here. I don't need this story about the little naked man running away. It doesn't even serve much of a purpose in Mark that we can see. So why would Matthew and Luke want to bring that story over? Or the healing of the blind man with 2 touches. Well, that doesn't make Jesus look very good. Now in Mark, it has a purpose because it's setting up the 2 touches and you need to know 2 things about Jesus. But if you don't have that programmatic use for it, why do you want a story where Jesus fails in a miracle? Right? So you can see why. Now, then the healing of the deaf man with spittle, well, scholars don't like spitting. That just seems gross. And so obviously the evangelists didn't like it either. So that's why they left it out. Well, I don't know about that. But is it more likely that Mark decided, okay, out of everything I could add, I'm just going to add these 3 stories, or that the other evangelists decided these 3 stories were things they could pass on? Yeah, I think in this case the second does seem more likely. Then you have oral tradition. The argument here, Griesbach's Mark is primarily scribal. Pretty much everything in Mark, according to Griesbach's model, is being copied either from Matthew or Luke, almost verbatim. But Mark is arguably the most oral of the 3 Gospels in the fast pace of the storytelling, the detail that is included, the action. It's also the least literary. It's more colloquial in its language. It's more unpolished, which again is very hard to reconcile with the idea of a scribe who's pretty much just copying, from other sources. So I think this is actually a fairly strong argument. The relationship of omissions and additions. Griesbach portrays Mark with conflicting redactional tendencies. So on the one hand, he's clarifying things like that evening, by which I mean at sunset, right? Bringing over both things in a redundant expression, while simultaneously making the material more obscure by omitting things like the fact that John the Baptist is Elijah. In Matthew, Jesus says this explicitly. In Mark, you've got to kind of intuit it out through his description and picking up on the Old Testament references and all of that. So on the one hand, he's making it redundant with stuff that you don't really need, while omitting things that would help clarify, which seems kind of at odds. And then the 7th factor that is used to argue for Markan priority is what's called editorial fatigue. Now, what is this? Take the story of Herod and Salome, where John the Baptist meets his end. In Mark, it says, King Herod heard of it, and Herodias had a grudge against him, this is John the Baptist, and wanted to kill him, but she could not, for Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he protected him. But then Salome does her dance, and he promises her, and she says, I want the head of John the Baptist. And the king was deeply grieved, yet out of regard for his oaths and for the guests, he did not want to refuse her. Okay? Now, who wants to kill John in Mark?
Herod.
No. Herodias, his wife. Salome is her daughter. Why is she not able to kill him?
Because her husband is afraid of him.
Right, because Herod actually fears John. He thinks he's a righteous guy. And so what is the king's response when Salome says, I want his head on a platter? He's grieved because he didn't want to put him to death in the first place, right? Yes, and so he does. He said, I would give you anything you asked for. I'm really sad you asked for this, but I'll do it. Now let's look at Matthew. Herod the ruler, and the word here is tetrarch, heard reports. Though Herod wanted to put him to death, he feared the crowd because they regarded him as a prophet. The king was grieved, yet out of regard for his oaths and for the guests, he commanded it to be given. Okay? Now, in Matthew, who wants to put him to death? Herod. Why doesn't he?
He's afraid of the people.
Yeah, he fears the crowds because the crowds think John is a prophet. Right? Now, how does Mark refer to Herod at the beginning? King. Right? In Mark, it's king. What about in Matthew? Ruler or tetrarch. Who's more accurate?
I say Matthew because they weren't kings, they were more like governors.
Yes. Yeah, Herod the Great was a king. Which Herod is this? It's not the Great. It's Herod Antipas, his son, who was over Galilee and Perea.
Not so great.
Right? Yeah. Yeah, this is Herod not so great. Remember, after Herod the Great dies, Rome has to step in because they're all bickering over who takes it, and they do not grant them the title king. Archelaus is made ethnarch, or ruler of the people. Philip and Herod are named tetrarchs. So Matthew is actually more accurate. Okay? Now, what is the king's response, or Herod's response in Matthew and Mark? Here he's deeply grieved. Here he's what? Why is he grieved in Matthew?
Out of God's oath for gifts.
But does he in Matthew?
Well, why is he grieved because of
In Mark, it makes perfect sense, right? Because in Mark, Herodias wants him dead, but Herod doesn't. And so now when he has to put him to death, he's like, I didn't really want to kill this guy. And that should be under grief, not get out. In Matthew, it doesn't make... This is what he's wanted the whole time. And now finally he has an excuse.
So why is he grieved?
Right? Yeah. Why is he grieved?
So this is one of the reasons they get from Matthew comment on Mark.
Right. Well, yeah, and notice what title we're using for him here.
King.
Whose language is that? Mark's. So the suggestion is what happens is called editorial fatigue. Matthew changes the beginning of the story, but then as it goes on, he kind of forgets to conform the end of the story to the changes he made at the beginning. And so this is there because he's just copying over from Mark. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Right? How many of you have ever written a paper and you go back and you change something in the beginning, but you forget to change something that corresponds at the end? Right? Yeah.
That's why
Right? Now again, a Griesbachian would look at this and say, well, Matthew's account didn't make sense, and so Mark fixed it. I mean, so you got to consider both ways. Is it more likely that Matthew wrote an incoherent account and Mark fixed it, or that Mark had a coherent account, Matthew changed parts of it, but then kind of just got into a flow and forgot to conform to the end to the beginning? Right? Yeah. Yeah, I think it makes more sense here that Mark was first and Matthew was working with Mark's passage, and that's why you get Mark's language king and the being grieved, which made a lot of sense over here, not so much over here. Right? All right. So, if Mark comes first, obviously then the Griesbach hypothesis can't be right. The 2 or 4 source hypothesis is the most commonly advocated model today in scholarship. Most books that you read will assume this model. And in this model, the two sources are Mark and Q. And the thought is that Matthew and Luke are each using Mark and Q independently. All right? And then the reason why it's two and sometimes four source is, then Matthew also has his own source of wherever he's getting other stuff that he's unique to Matthew, and Luke has his stuff that's unique to him. So either two source or four source if you want to account for the stuff unique to Matthew and Luke.
Okay, now this was the answer to a question on a quiz.
Mm-hmm.
You would say 2-4 source theory, or you could just get along with 2 or just 4 myself?
Either one, any of those.
Okay.
And if again, on the quizzes where you have to type in answers, if I didn't anticipate the exact way you happen to do it, but you know you got it right,
Okay.
don't worry about it. Okay? So,
Y'all heard it, right?
on those quizzes on the computer. All right. The reason you need Q. So this is the triple tradition, right? Stuff that's appearing in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. This Q line is the source of the double tradition, right? The stuff that appears in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. Okay? Q is a hypothesis derived from the postulate that Matthew and Luke used Mark independently of one another. If Matthew knows Luke or Luke knows Matthew, you don't need Q. Why? Yeah. So I may have mentioned this example last time, but say that my friend from Fuller over in California calls me up and says, "Oh, I just read this paragraph in one of my students' papers. It's brilliant. You got to hear it." He reads it to me. So, that sounds familiar. I just read a very similar paragraph. Let me find it. And we find out it's verbatim. Exact same paragraph. How do we explain that? Well, obviously the Holy Spirit inspired both students to write exactly the same thing. Yeah.
So these are what they're going to tell you.
I have had students tell me that. It didn't work then either. So how could we explain it?
One knew the other.
Yeah, so let's say we do a little research and we find out they're both from the same hometown. They both grew up in Baltimore and went to high school together. Well, then how do we account for them having... Well, because one likely wrote it, and then the other person, got a copy of that paper and decided to just lift it.
Yeah.
Right? But let's say we do some research and find out these two have never communicated. They didn't know each other. One grew up in Washington, one grew up in Alabama, and they haven't had any connection. How could we possibly explain the fact that they have identical paragraphs in their paper? Yes, by which we mean what? Or some other source, right? There must be some source, either on the web or a book, or there is some third source out there that they are both using and copying from, right? So, if Matthew and Luke don't know each other, the only way to explain how they have so much verbatim agreement is if they're both copying from a common source. Right? So, evidence that supports this model is going to be evidence that supports the idea that Matthew and Luke do not know each other. Evidence that suggests they do know each other is going to undermine this model. Because if they do know it, if Luke knows Matthew, and that's usually the way it goes, if Luke knows Matthew, then you don't need Q in order to explain how they have the same stuff. He just got it from Matthew.
What's the logic that they want to it makes sense to me.
Well, we've got to look at the evidence and see if we can make a case. And that's what scholars do. They go through and try to make a case. These are reasons why it seems unlikely they knew each other. Or these are reasons that it seems likely they probably did know each other. Okay? So, what are the reasons why scholars think they didn't know each other? Did not. So, that support this particular model. One is Luke's order. And this is one of their major arguments. Matthew and Luke usually put double tradition material in different spots relative to Mark. This is what we talked about earlier. Matthew's placement of double tradition in Markan framework almost always makes sense. Luke's does not, at least according to these scholars. So how does this support the idea that they don't know each other?
Because of how they put it in different places.
Yeah, and if Luke is using Matthew, surely at some point, especially since Matthew makes so much sense, he would have said, you know what, that's a good place for that paragraph. It seems unlikely that Luke would be using Matthew and Mark, and every time he gets to a passage that's in Matthew that's not in Mark, he goes, I got to move it. And so he moves it somewhere else. On the other hand, if they're both independently using a third source, or second source, or however you want to talk about it, a cue, then you could see how they end up putting the common material in different places. Because there's no established tradition for where it is supposed to go. Does that make sense? Now, the problem with this is that it's a subjective evaluation of the evidence. Look quickly at Allende 129. It's on page 119. Yeah, section 129. What is section 129? Parable of the leaven. Now, look above and see what it follows in both Matthew and Luke. Yes. Yeah, in both Matthew and Luke, the parable of the leaven follows the parable of the mustard seed. Right? Now, Luke has put it in a different spot relative to Mark. That's why his is not boldface. Right? But here you have an instance where Matthew and Luke put the so-called Q material in the same spot relative to Mark. Right? So how do you explain it? Well, they'll make it... They either group the passage bigger and say that it forms one passage, and this then becomes a Mark Q overlap, which we'll talk about in a minute. Or they have to make a case, well, it's so obvious that the parable of the leaven goes along with the parable of the mustard seed that they both put it here. Right? Any rational person can see that this makes perfect sense to put the parable of leaven right next to the parable of the mustard seed. Not before, but after. Right? Because again, you can't have Luke know that Matthew put it under there. So if Luke can't know that Matthew put it there, you have to explain how Luke decided to put it there too. Right?
So that's a potential hole in the argument.
Yes. Yeah. I actually don't think this model works very well, even though it's the one that's most commonly adopted. Okay. This idea that Matthew makes sense and Luke doesn't, well, that's kind of underestimating Luke's, literary skill. But this is a major argument. How if they do know each other, why are they most of the time putting this stuff in different spots? Okay. All right.
Would it also suggest that they're from the same region?
Possibly. That gets a little harder to judge just based on these kinds of things. The second main argument is alternating primitivity. Who seems to have the older version? Okay. Luke sometimes appears to have an earlier version of the double tradition than Matthew, and sometimes Matthew seems to have the earlier version. Now again, why does that suggest they don't know each other? Well, if Luke is copying Matthew and changing Matthew periodically, you would expect Matthew to always have the older version and Luke to have the edited version. If, however, they're both copying from Q, well, sometimes Matthew might make changes and sometimes Luke might make changes.
Correct.
Right? So you would expect sometimes Matthew would have the older version, sometimes Luke would have the older version. Okay? Are there any potential problems with this? Well, how do you know which is older?
Yeah. How many years difference are we talking about?
Well, and even that, given two passages, how can you tell me which one was written first? It becomes difficult to make those kind of assessments. So it's hard to determine. It's also not a problem if Luke has oral traditions. And so sometimes he's conforming it to the tradition that he knows. Right? Which might make it appear older or, rougher or however you're going to make those determinations. The way this usually goes is they'll say, well, the passage in Matthew uses a lot of vocabulary that Matthew likes. And Luke's doesn't have that, so it seems more likely that Matthew has, added in the vocabulary to make it fit with his story, so Luke's is older. But these things are very difficult to determine. Okay? Okay? Third one, Luke's lack of M material. If Luke knew Matthew, surely there's some of this M material that he would have found helpful for his story that he would have brought over.
That's not the case.
Hmm?
That's not the case.
Well, we have all this M material that is not in Luke.
Right.
And so surely he would have brought over some of this M material. Matthew has some good stuff that Luke surely would have wanted to bring over if he had known Matthew. The problem here, well, if he does bring over something from M, what happens to that material?
It becomes L material.
It becomes Q material.
Oh, okay.
You could say that Q is all the stuff in Matthew that Luke liked. Right? Because Q is the stuff that appears in both Matthew and Luke.
Okay.
So anytime Luke would take something from Matthew, by definition, it becomes Q. Right? So this is kind of a circular argument. You can't. Anything that's included becomes Q, and so you could never have him taking stuff from M material such that it wouldn't become Q.
And 4 is kind of the reverse of it, right?
Yeah. All right, the fourth one. Luke's ignorance of Matthew's modifications. If Luke knew Matthew, surely sometimes he would have preferred the way Matthew phrased something or Matthew's version of the story over Mark's.
And if Luke gets some of Matthew's material, it becomes Q.
Right. Right, yes, you can swap those. Again, usually it goes with Luke using Matthew, so that's the way I've kind of phrased it. But yeah, you could swap it either way. So here, you could also talk about Matthew's ignorance of Luke's modifications. Well, does Luke, and we'll continue to talk about it in that way, does Luke know Matthew's changes to Mark? Well, let's look and see. There are two types of problems here. The first are called minor agreements. Okay? So here's the beginning of the passage that we looked at last time. If we're going to underline, common words, what would we underline in red for Matthew and Mark? Okay, and, good. Yeah, we could probably do the he. I don't have it marked on here. And if we do Mark and Luke, you got days. And that's about it. There's not a lot in common. Right? And remember we said they tend to differ the most at the beginning and the end. Now, just take a minute. What's the setting according to Matthew? Where is he?
Across the road.
He's in his own city, but no more specific than that. Right? What about Mark? It was reported that he was at home. Many were gathered together. There's no longer room for them, even about the door, and he's preaching to them. Right? So he's in a home, and there's a lot of people crowded around. What about Luke? One of those days, as he was teaching, there were Pharisees and teachers of the law sitting by who had come from every village of Galilee and Judea and from Jerusalem, and the power of the Lord was with him to heal. Yeah, and Luke, it doesn't say specifically, but it sounds like kind of an outdoor teaching, right? Because there's some Pharisees sitting over here and other people gathering. Okay, so we have three kind of different introductions to this story. Then this is what we looked at last time. We've got and, they, bringing with a dotted line. And then in Luke, and were bringing, was paralyzed with paralytic. And then in Matthew and Luke, and behold, brought versus were bringing, paralytic versus was paralyzed. And then we also have on and bed. This is a curious case where it's actually the same phrase in Greek, but here they translate on his bed, there on a bed. So we'll mark it that way. Does Luke know Matthew's changes? Well, how many times do Luke and Matthew agree over against Mark in this one verse? Well, okay, let's count them. What's the first one? Okay, behold, right? They both have a behold where Mark doesn't. All right, what's the next one? Well, so they both change it, but they changed it in different ways, so they don't agree over against Mark in that case. On a bed. And that one's really odd, because the word bed here is like a four-poster. When Mark refers to it, he talks about a pallet. Now, a pallet makes sense. It's curious that they would both change Mark's pallet. I mean, he hasn't gotten to the word yet, but he's going to. To bed. Yes. Yes. I mean, you normally don't carry a big bed with somebody down the street. You carry a pallet. Yeah. So that one's really curious. Why they both opt for bed. Okay. Are there any others? They also both agree in not saying that it was carried by four men. So you have to count the things they both omit as well. Right? So in this one verse, we have three fairly distinctive agreements. Now, if Luke doesn't know Matthew, you have to explain why they both thought it was appropriate to make those three changes independently. Well, no, you can't appeal to Q in this case because this is something they're getting from Mark. Right? So you have to argue, well, the story obviously doesn't work if you just say and. You got to say, and behold! Right? Well, I mean, is that really so obvious that they would both feel compelled to add a behold after and? Or again, why are we switching to bed, which is a really awkward word for this story? And again, why? Okay, maybe they both opted to leave out that it was carried by four men. Take that and multiply it by the thousands. Because there are thousands of these minor agreements. And so Q scholars who support the two-source, four-source model, have to go through and for each one explain how Matthew and Luke both independently landed on that particular change. Right? Because they can't know each other. Does that make sense? So the presence of these minor agreements kind of undermine this model.
So out of all the theories about the Synoptic Gospels, the two-source, four-source is the most prevalent?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. But that doesn't mean it's not without its problems. Right?
But I thought, like you said, that Matthew and Luke, that Q was how Matthew and Luke were able to have the same information.
Right, in this model.
So would that be a component? Would that justify the Q? If Matthew and Luke are having similar information, would that be an argument for the Q?
No, because they're getting this passage from Mark.
But
And if Mark and Q have the same passages, then you start to get into trouble because Mark and Q have verbatim agreement. And how do they agree?
and I get that, but how does this prove that they're getting their information from Mark? I mean, what is it that I'm missing here that's telling me that this passage proves that they're getting their information from Mark. Just because they agree does not necessarily mean that they're getting the information from Mark. So that's
Well, because you have verbatim agreement with Mark. So some either Mark is copying from them or they're copying from Mark. Or I mean, they could all be copying from Matthew depending on how.
because Mark.
But if you take Mark as being first,
Okay.
which is the first premise of this, that Mark came first.
Model here, there's no connection between Mark and Q.
Correct.
So that's that.
Yeah, Mark and Q cannot know each other
Right, so
because
they have to get it from Mark.
Yes.
That's the proof. Okay.
yeah, and actually the more you kind of conflate Mark and Q,
Right.
the more Q starts to look like Matthew,
I got you.
and eventually, why don't we just say it's Matthew?
Okay. I got you.
I also remember reading somewhere that the Greek, that Mark used a lot more primitive
Yes,
and grammatically
rough.
rough. Okay.
Yes.
Colloquial.
Yeah, which is one of the reasons why it makes more sense to me and many others that Mark comes first. Because it seems the roughest, the most colloquial, the closest to oral tradition. So yes. Yes.
And the consequent gospel is a little more stylish.
Yes.
A little more-
Yeah. But again, don't discount Mark's literary ability because it is a very carefully crafted gospel.
Why do you think there's more said about the oral tradition? It just seems like to me nobody can read or write for the most part.
In this particular case, because we're looking at verbatim agreements, and that's going to come from copying from written sources. I mean, if you talk about oral, so think about the telephone game. You never end up with exactly the same word, even if you get, and even then it's often. So when you've got exact wording, you're looking at copying from written sources. In this passage, there's not much because of the crowd, the roof, let down, and it's not even this much because they is part of the Greek verb, so it doesn't show up independently in Greek. That's an English thing. Roof and let down are the same in English, but in Greek it's different words. So if you were marking it in Greek, you wouldn't mark that at all. But now, note for a minute, remember what was Luke's setting? Seems he was out teaching somewhere, probably outside, because you got Pharisees sitting over to the side and all that. But now, finding no way to bring him in because of the crowd, they went up on the roof and let him down with his bed through the tiles into the midst before Jesus. So suddenly now, no, he's in an enclosed space with lots of people around and they got to go up on the roof. Is this another example of editorial fatigue? Where he's kind of changed the beginning of the story, but then kind of lets the story flow as Mark tells it more or less in ways that are not necessarily consistent with the changes he made at the beginning. Does that make sense? Because we haven't heard anything about Jesus being in an enclosed room or being so crowded no one could get to him. Or anything. All that's in Mark, but Luke hasn't told us any of that.
So he just jumped to the part where they let him into the room.
Yeah. And again, pallet versus bed. And bed is the same word that we had in Matthew. Why are we using bed instead of pallet, which makes a lot more sense? And the way scholars will often say, justify this, they'll say, well, pallet was a vulgar word. He didn't want to use such a common word.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't want to say the word pallet. The problem, though, is he does use it in Acts. And if he can use it in Acts, why couldn't he use it in Mark or in his gospel? So there are those curiosities. Luke has not mentioned they are in a house. Just to quickly finish out the marking. And you notice as we get into it, it suddenly gets a lot more verbatim, right? Suddenly we got a lot of verbatim agreement. All right. You should never have more than 2 colors in any gospel, right? Because anything that has 2 colors under it is in all 3. All right? And anything that is not underlined is unique to that gospel. All right? Okay, so minor agreements are a problem. There are also major agreements. So if you take something like the temptation account, what was Mark's temptation account like?
Mark's temptation.
Yeah, he went into the wilderness to be tempted, and after 40 days, he came out. What is it like in Matthew? Well, he goes through 3 different temptations with Satan coming up, and same thing in Luke. Luke has the same 3 temptations that Matthew does, slightly different order. The last 2 are switched, but otherwise the same temptations. That's a pretty big agreement over against Mark, which has none of that. So that's what's called a major agreement. Well, how do you explain that? And the way this model does is they say that, well, this is a Mark-Q overlap. Meaning it's a passage that appears in both Mark and Q, and Matthew and Luke both preferred Q's version. Okay? Now, ideally, you want the Markan part to be fairly distinct, because otherwise you end up with a problem of Mark and Q having verbatim agreement, which suggests that they have some knowledge of each other or something. In most of these cases, that is true. The parable of the leaven, however, the parable of the mustard seed is pretty much the same in all 3. So you don't get a distinctive Markan version of that like you would like if you wanted to argue for a Mark-Q overlap. When B.H. Streeter was the one who first kind of identified these Mark-Q overlaps, and he had a very long list. Because there are a lot of passages where you see this kind of stuff. Until people pointed out, well, your Q is starting to look a lot like Matthew. And so you can't have too many of these Mark-Q overlaps without Q becoming Matthew. And so they went through and pared it down to only the most egregious. And so you can see the 6 passages or so up here that are identified as Mark-Q overlaps. And that's how they explain that Matthew and Luke seem to know the same tradition of a Markan passage that's very different. Does that make sense? So Matthew had both Mark's temptation account and Q's temptation account, which was much longer, and he decided he liked Q's version, so that's what he put in. Luke saw those 2 accounts and also liked Q's version, and so that's what he used. Okay? All right. But minor and major agreements both suggest that Luke knows Matthew, or if you want, Matthew knows Luke, which would tend to undermine the model. Because again, if they know one another, then you don't need Q. Okay? The 5th argument is that Q is distinctive and useful. Well, the problem with that, Q is the Luke-pleasing elements of Matthew minus Mark. So you would expect it to be kind of distinctive and have some coherence and unity, because it's what Luke saw in Matthew's independent tradition that he wanted to bring over. At the same time, usefulness is not a good argument. Just because something is useful doesn't mean it's true. Right? We'll see this when we get to historical Jesus work. A lot of historical Jesus, one of the criteria for determining whether something is historical is multiple attestation. If you have, if Sam and Michelle both come tell me about this horrible event that happened, how many sources do I have? 2. But what if Michelle sees it and she goes and tells Sam, and then they both come tell me? How many sources do I have? 1. Michelle's the only source. Yeah. Yeah, and you're right. Right. So if Matthew's using Mark and Luke is using Matthew and Mark, how many sources do we have for all of this stuff? 1. If, however, Mark and Q are independent early sources, then you can argue for independent attestation. So it becomes very useful for historical Jesus scholars to be able to refer to Q, because then they have another early independent source that they can pair things with. Again, that doesn't make it true, right? We have never found Q. No one in the ancient world references Q or anything that would seem to be Q. So as my doctoral advisor said, New Testament scholars would be a lot better off if every morning they got up, looked in the mirror, and said, we have never found Q. You can buy a commentary on Q that is, I think, over 1,000 pages. It goes not just through Q, but different editions of Q. 4 different editions of Q that he has been able to reconstruct. I have no idea how you do this.
Well, it sells newspapers.
Exactly, yeah. Something's got to keep people busy in the academy, and so they do this. So,
That's okay.
so the final model is the Farrer-Golder hypothesis, which is that Mark came first, Matthew used Mark, and Luke used both. Right? In this one, we don't need Q because you can explain the commonalities between Matthew and Luke on the grounds that Luke just got them from Matthew. Okay? Mark Goodacre goes through a lot of this in the case against Q reading that you had.
Yes.
One of the things he points out, it's often suggested, if Luke knew Matthew, why in the world would he have split up the Sermon on the Mount? It's such a beautiful sermon, who only a crank would dare to divide up the Sermon on the Mount. And as Goodacre points out, have you ever read the Sermon on the Mount? It's really long. We split it up all the time, right? You never hear a sermon on the entire Sermon on the Mount. It's too long. It's 3 chapters, right? Movies about Jesus. He'll say the Beatitudes, and then we move on, right? You don't get all 3 chapters. So Goodacre's point, we split it up all the time, and Luke probably did the same thing. Any questions about the different gospel models? Okay, I think this one is probably, of the 3, I prefer this one. Although again, the truth is probably more complicated and complex than we can represent in a simple little graph like this. But it's good to be aware of these because again, you'll read commentaries and they'll talk about Q and their analysis will be based on how Q is being changed and adapted, and if you don't subscribe to that model, then that calls in some of their analysis into question. A growing number of scholars, by the way, are adopting this. The Farrer-Golder hypothesis. All right. Yes. The 4 is if you include M and L as Matthew's independent source and Luke's independent source. If you want to just pick one and say 2 source or 4 source and just go with it, that's fine. That's fine. And if it leads to less confusion, it's just whether you're considering M and Luke to be sources that they're using as well, or M and L. Okay? All right. There are some other synoptic facts. You can just read those on your own.